In March of 1988, New York resident Amaury Rivera traveled to Puerto Rico in order to visit his grandmother. After several weeks, Rivera came back to his home in New York. However, his time in Puerto Rico proved to be especially important to him. Even though many of his relatives were unemployed and more opportunities seemed available in New York, Amaury would move back down to Puerto Rico permanently just 2 months later. Little did he know this decision would change his life forever. In this episode, we will examine the unbelievable alien abduction of Amaury Rivera. In May 1988, Amaury Rivera moved back down to Puerto Rico. Amaury was attracted to the island. The culture, the beaches, and the lifestyle suited him better than the loud, polluted city of New York. Once he arrived in Puerto Rico, friends found him an apartment, and soon he would purchase a 1971 Toyota for transportation around the island. Soon he began working odd jobs, such as waiting tables and running a hot dog stand. With family and friends nearby, life was good for Amaury, and he was happy with his life. That would soon all change though. On Mother's Day weekend in 1988, Amaury Rivera was asked by his cousin to wait tables and photograph an event at the Casablanca Club. Needing extra cash, Amaury obliged and borrowed his cousin's camera. The event that night was packed, with many people highly intoxicated, and the party going into the early hours of the morning. Around 4 a.m., Amaury packed his things and began heading to his car. He soon left and started heading home on a familiar route. Around 4:30 a.m., Amaury would enter a dense, white fog on the road. The fog wasn't unusual though, as he had drove this route many times and seen the fog before, late at night. Then suddenly, Amaury heard a noise on the passenger side of the car. It sounded like someone was running next to his car. When he looked over, he was astonished to see there was someone there. It was short, and he thought it was a boy with a costume wearing a mask initially. However, none of that made sense. How could a boy be running and keeping up with the car? Also, why would a boy be out this time of night? As he looked closer, he became frightened. He attempted to speed off, but instead of accelerating, he actually hit the brake and the car stopped. The being was now in front of him. It was clear at this point that it was something else. The being had palish gray skin, large eyes, was around 3.5 to 4 feet tall, and was wearing olive, tight-fitted clothing. As he was staring at it, what he described as a hideous creature, another being appeared right next to his driver's door. The beings then opened both car doors, and at this point, in fear, Amaury passed out. He soon woke up, and to his terror, one of the beings was sitting right next to him in the passenger seat. Amaury was absolutely terrified. He didn't move, and the being would reach out, its long, pointy fingers toward him, touching his forehead. Once again, a frightened Amaury passed out. When he woke up, he was terrified to see where he was. He was in a light, gray room with 14 other individuals, men and women, mostly looking Latino. The room was very peculiar, not appearing to have walls and having some type of optical illusion. The men and women sat in 3 rows, 5 each. In front of them, the 2 beings stood. Soon, another being would come in and greet the group. This being looked human though. He was around 5'7", with a lean, muscular look. Amaury recalled it looked Latino. It began speaking to the group in perfect Spanish and introduced himself as Amaron. Amaron would state he was human as well, but came from the planet Ka. He stressed he was not there to hurt them. After seeing a group horrified and fearful, Amaury explained the other beings were harmless and were created by his people. He would go on to say that they were going to show them some projections. The projections weren't real though, he stressed. The group began looking at a gorgeous landscape and were in a lush valley. They weren't looking at a screen though. The entire room had transformed into a beautiful land. The human-like being and the small alien stood, watching the group. They were instructed to look at the sky. Soon the group began ascending and were eventually over the trees. They kept hovering and soon were well above Earth in space. They eventually reached what Amaury told them was Ka's solar system, heading toward the planet. The being, who Amaury named the instructor, would begin to lecture the group on how humans had destroyed the planet Earth. During this time, Amaury would take notice of what was happening to the others around him. He was somewhat paralyzed, but he heard crying, trembling, vomiting from others. As they descended into the planet Ka, the land appeared gorgeous. From high up, Amaury noted that there was just one large continent with an ocean surrounding it. As they got closer to the ground, Amaury could make out a few more details. There were flowers everywhere, and eventually they flew over one of the towns. There, they saw glass pyramids, which the being told them were homes. The ground looked like it was a grass carpet, according to Amaury. They also noticed human-like beings. The beings waved at the group. There were mothers holding their babies, and Amaury remembered everyone was naked. Generally, the place was beautiful. While they watched the beings, it was complete silence inside the craft. The instructor would begin to tell the group about their people. According to him, death was very unusual. Amaury recalled not seeing anyone that looked over 25, and the being said at a particular age, people stopped aging. The instructor told the group that when they get injured, they are capable of regenerating quickly. The tour of the planet Ka continued, and the group would be shown several other places. This included the government center and also a farm that was tended by beings that looked like the smaller ones that had first taken him. Eventually the group came back to the original landscape and the projection faded. The instructor began talking directly to each person. He stressed that we needed to start taking care of the planet, and he stressed that it had to happen. He called each individual one by one. When he got to Amaury, he was so scared he couldn't look him in the eye. The being wanted him to take care of the flowers and the trees. While the first projection was mesmerizing, albeit frightening for everyone, the second projection would be downright terrifying. The second projection began with a group in Puerto Rico looking up in the sky. As Amaury looked up, he noticed a massive rock, like a meteor, heading toward them from outer space. It was getting closer and closer. Even though it was a projection, the realism of the event can't be understated, as others began to faint, and Amaury himself was extremely frightened. It soon slammed into the ocean, creating a massive tidal wave that headed toward the group and the coast of Puerto Rico. It eventually hit shore, and Amaury recalled hearing others scream. Below in the carnage, the group could see washed-up homes and the island completely covered by water. All of the group, the men and the women, were horrified and crying uncontrollably at the sight. They could feel the event. They heard the sights and the sounds, as well as saw the death and the destruction. After this, Amaury would have his seat move toward the front for the third projection. The third projection was even more terrifying than the second. The beings took the group to the White House and began to lecture them. He stressed that the governments were purely self-serving and that they only looked out for their own interest. In the projection, the White House shook and crumbled to the ground. The instructor informed everyone that earthquakes and tsunamis would become part of everyday life in the future. The projection showed severe homelessness, starvation, and people in encampments. The instructor told them that the sea, too, would become polluted, and all life there would die. The population on Earth would sharply decline. The instructor went on to say that the rich and powerful would be okay. They would meet on a man-made island named Atlantis when the chaos began, leaving the common man and common woman behind. On the island, the people that ironically caused the disaster lived well. They would experience no suffering, and no one would be allowed to come and go from there. The island was shown to the group in detail. It was a pretty place, like paradise, with ice cream shops, people riding on bicycles, and lavish parties. The rest of humanity, though, was suffering as they struggled to find food, clean water, and medicine. In time, a gigantic earthquake would occur on Earth, destroying the planet, even the private island. The group was shown a view of it from space, and they could see a dust cloud formed over it. The group would then see an image of a group of survivors on Earth. A giant craft came down and saved the group, taking them to another planet. The instructor informed the group that when Earth became healthy again, they would take them back. The smaller creature then went around one by one, touching people on their foreheads. As it touched someone, he or she passed out. Eventually, it touched Amaury Rivera's head, and he passed out. Amaury soon woke up in his car. However, he was in a different place. The road was not the one he was on earlier. He looked up in the sky and saw the craft hovering away. At the same time, he heard military helicopters and planes coming to the area. He was still crying and overwhelmed with emotion from his experience. He stepped out of the car and snapped a few pictures before the craft flew off into the sky. He then proceeded to start driving, and after stopping and asking for directions several times, he finally arrived at home. He was exhausted and collapsed into bed and slept all day and until the next morning. He seemed to forget what had happened to him that day. A few days later, he gave his cousin back her camera. His cousin would develop the film and call Amaury. She asked over the phone what were the pictures. A confused Amaury wasn't sure what she was talking about, so he went over to her home. As he went through the photos, he was horrified to see photos of the beings and the UFO. He saw the instructor and felt a deep sense of dread. His memory of the event somehow had been blocked, and he remembered the initial encounter. However, he couldn't recall what happened to him after he fainted until the time he woke up in his car. That truly terrified him. Amaury left his cousin's home quickly. Rushing home, climbed into bed in the fetal position. His family tried for hours to open the door, but he was non-responsive. He would suffer PTSD for quite some time after the event. His family was extremely concerned, but in time, he seemed to come with grips with his experience. Still terrified, it would take some time before he would tell his full story to anyone. In the following months and years, his experience got out, and he would encounter many strange government people. On one occasion, 3 agents, claiming to be from the CIA, came to his house. They demanded the photos and the negatives, and if he didn't provide them, they said they would make his life extremely difficult. The men came in the home and searched even, but couldn't find the photos. Eventually his photos would make it into the public and are considered quite credible. Amaury only released 4 of them from the event. In one of them, you can clearly see a military aircraft, and what looks like a UFO. The photos were sent for analysis, and there was no evidence found of any type of tampering or altering. Interestingly, according to ufologist Colonel Wendell Stephen, the human-like alien known as the instructor that abducted Amaury has been reported by other abductees in the Puerto Rico area. There have been several cases in which that particular alien was reported all over the island, especially in the southwest part of the country. In addition, other abductees reported some of the same details that Amaury revealed. The Amaury Rivera case is certainly a fascinating one. There's quite a bit to unpack as far as what happened. To begin, the alien's message about protecting the Earth is one we hear time and time again with alien encounters and abductions. For example, we saw this in the Ariel school incident in Zimbabwe. There are other cases as well of abductees being shown projections or images. Still, it is tough to know how prevalent this is because it seems many are having their memories wiped. It appears in Amaury's case that if it had not been for the photos, he may have forgotten the event. It's not entirely clear whether the beings did wipe his memory or if the trauma was just too much and his subconscious buried the memories. While the Amaury case seems like something out of science fiction, the case appears to be quite legit. The witness appears credible and clearly suffered quite a bit after the event. By all accounts, Amaury Rivera was a happy, carefree man, and after the event, he became isolated. For quite some time, he worked and simply came home, refusing to go out at night. This case does raise some interesting questions though. For example, why were middle-class Puerto Ricans being tasked with changing humanity? It would seem more logical for the beings to abduct more powerful men and women if they truly wanted change. Another question concerns the projections themselves. The first projection shows the beauty of the planet Ka, but no one was invited to the home to stay. Nor was anyone given specifics around how they achieved such a utopia. The second projection has to do with the meteor. Is this what the beings plan to do to us if we don't clean up our act? This is what seems to be implied from this projection. The third projection shows the collapse of Earth. The beings seem to imply we are responsible for the daily earthquakes and tsunamis. At this time, there doesn't appear to be any weapon, to the best of our knowledge, that can create these or alter nature this much. So the second and third projections appear to contradict themselves in terms of the message. One implies they punish us. The other is that through our actions, we punish ourselves. Many believe Amaury imagined the whole event. This is a valid concern, but much like the Carlos Diaz case on a prior episode, the photos appear to be pretty solid support. One final thing that must be pointed out is the message delivered to Amaury may have been misinterpreted. Even he admits this. Still though, it appears overall this is a solid case, and hopefully these beings have stopped their abductions. Over the years, there's been numerous reports of alien abductions. Often, these stories sound unbelievable, with bizarre events occurring and strange conversations with the beings. Perhaps one of the more stranger things that we've seen are some alien abductees reporting that DNA was extracted and some type of clone was produced. These allegations sound extremely far-fetched, but it's important to point out there are some cases of abductees reporting this. In this episode, we will examine one such case, the 1985 alien abduction of 23-year-old Xavier Clares. On July 21st, 1985, around 8 o'clock in the morning, Spaniard Xavier Clares grabbed several cameras and drove from Barcelona to snap photographs of Dolmen de la Pedra Gental of El Gargina. El Dolmen is a 5,000-year-old megalithic structure around 50 kilometers outside Barcelona. Xavier spent about 2 hours sightseeing the area and photographing the megalith. It was a beautiful day with no clouds in the sky, and Xavier was able to get a number of photos of the structure. After this, he began driving back home, and he returned. He would be shocked to see that his odometer was much higher than expected. Instead of just adding 50 kilometers, the odometer was now 300 kilometers higher. It didn't make sense, and Xavier had checked it before he left for the trip. The car was also dirty. There was some sort of sticky substance all over the seats. There was mud all over the wheels, even though the area he was in was completely dry. During that time, there actually was a drought in the area. Things would get even more strange from here, though. When Xavier returned, all the stores were open in the area. This was odd because he left on a Sunday, and the majority of the stores were closed on Sunday in the city. As Xavier entered his home, his wife and brother let out a sigh of relief and began pressing him on where he had been. Xavier was confused as to what was going on. The two would go on to tell him he had been gone for almost 2 days. It was now Monday, around 6 p.m., and they had scoured the area looking for him. Things would get even more scary, though, for Xavier. Xavier began to look at his things for more details as to what happened. On one of his cameras, he noticed there had been some photos taken, although he never remembered taking them. Xavier decided to have the photos developed, and when he saw them, there would be several faces which he described as green and demonic. The situation had become much more frightening, and Xavier decided to consult a professional. He called Terrel Ramus, a parapsychologist that he had known for years. Ramus would see the photos and realize the seriousness of the situation. After discussing it a bit more, Terrel would discover that Xavier had been having strange encounters for years. He had been visited at night by the Greys. Xavier never seemed concerned, though, as he felt they were benevolent and never harmed him. Terrel wanted to uncover the missing time and what happened, so she suggested Xavier go under hypnosis. Professor Francisco de Assis Rovati Heredia, a noted Spanish parapsychologist, was selected for the job. Heredia was very experienced in conducting these sessions, especially with alien abductees. During the sessions, Xavier would learn the following as to what happened. As Xavier was driving, he would spot a fog up ahead on the road. He remembered just how strange it was, since it was a clear and sunny day. He seemed to black out, and the next thing he recalled was waking up on the side of the road. A sticky substance began falling on his head, and he stood up to see a group of beings. They didn't resemble the ones that usually visit him in the nighttime, though. The beings insisted that he go with them, but Xavier didn't want to go. They insisted and said they want to see how he is. The next thing he remembered was going down to some type of slope or ramp. Xavier recalls heading down toward a cave, but he's unable to head back up. The beings appear to be enjoying themselves, and Xavier is disgusted by their appearance. They are all gray, really wrinkled, with some sort of liquidy substance oozing from their skin. In the cave, or wherever they are, the air stinks like rotten eggs, and Xavier recalled having trouble breathing. The beings then began communicating with him telepathically. They're speaking Spanish and telling Xavier they need to put a catheter-like device in his arm. He tries to fight back and resist, but the beings touch him and paralyze him. As they start to draw blood, Xavier asks where they are from. Telepathically, they tell Xavier they are from Cassiopeia. Xavier asks a few more questions, and then the beings state that they are going to clone Xavier. Xavier is terrified at this point and believes they will kill him once the replica is made. The next thing he remembers is waking up in his car. His replica is sitting right behind him in the back seat. The being looks just like Xavier, even wearing the same clothes. The only difference, though, is the alien has longer hair. The clone doesn't speak, but just creepily laughs at Xavier. The being would tell Xavier to drive and drop him off at the corners of Vilas-Boas and Cons de Balac in Barcelona. While it doesn't appear that Xavier would see his replica after this, several friends and family would tell him they saw him in places Xavier never was. On one occasion, a friend of Xavier reported that he saw him walking on Mercado del Duero. Xavier, though, hadn't gone to that area in months. The person would go on to tell Xavier the person he saw was wearing the clothes Xavier was wearing on the day he was taken. Xavier would later discover months after the event he had 3 triangular-shaped punctures on his left arm. What can we make of this case? It surely seems like a work of science fiction. However, there are some characteristics that lend support to the story. 1. Xavier mentioned the being spoke in perfect Spanish and telepathically. This is a detail we have seen in other alien encounters and abductions. There's various languages, of course, but the theme is the language was spoken perfectly. One other interesting detail is the fog on the road. That is something we have seen in other alien abduction cases. In 2 prior episodes we have covered on this channel, the Amaury Rivera alien abduction and the Bayamon alien abduction in Puerto Rico, a strange mist was reported both prior to those abductions. Missing time in the prior visitations provides some support as well, although missing time could be a number of things. While this case does have some credible things, the biggest glaring weakness is that almost all the details come when Xavier was under hypnosis. This is important as in it doesn't appear that Xavier has any conscious memory of the events. Most often we see individuals able to remember some of the events prior to hypnosis. Perhaps the strangest aspect of this case, though, has to do with the duplicates. This feels like something out of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, yet throughout history, there has been multiple stories of people running into their doppelgangers. A well-known case, which was covered a long time ago on this channel, was the case of Percy Shelley, husband of Frankenstein author Mary Shelley. Percy was convinced he had seen his doppelganger, and months after this occurred, he would die at sea. Many believe that alien hybrids walk among us, and while there's no evidence of this, it's certainly a frightening thought. While the case of Xavier is definitely a controversial one, it's certainly interesting, and hopefully one we can learn from. On November 9th, 1979, a Scottish forestry worker would have one of the most famous extraterrestrial encounters in the history of the country. Bob Taylor showed up to work expecting to have a normal day of work, however his experience would be anything but. In time, this case became famous for being the first UFO sighting to be subject of a police criminal investigation. In fact, this case has never been solved, and the lead investigator on it has pointed out the unexplainable physical evidence found at the scene. In this episode, we will examine the extraordinary story of Bob Taylor, a case that became to be known as the Livingston Incident, or sometimes the Taylor Incident. Around 10:30 a.m. on November 9th, 1979, Bob Taylor, who was employed by the Livingston Development Corporation, drove his truck and parked at the bottom of Detchmont Law. Detchmont Law is a hill that sits in West Livingston, Scotland. Along with his dogs, Bob began climbing the hill for his daily routine, checking fences and gates. As Bob crested one portion of the hill, he would be stunned to see something incredible. In a clearing not too far away, Bob saw a dome-shaped object around 20 feet across and 30 feet high. The object was dark and had looked like it was rough sandpaper. Next, what happened would truly be shocking. A curious Bob and his dogs approached the craft, and 2 balls came down from the ship. They were around 3 feet across with metal spikes protruding through them. They began rolling towards Bob and attached themselves to his pants. Bob's dogs were barking furiously, but it clearly wasn't stopping the objects. The 2 balls began pulling Bob closer to the larger craft, and Bob smelled some type of burning odor. He would then pass out. Bob next woke up on the ground, and he would be perplexed about what had happened. He had a terrible headache, a sore throat, and a bitter taste for some reason in his mouth. He believes he was unconscious for around 20 minutes. The UFO and the 2 small balls were gone, but Bob was disheveled. He struggled to walk, but finally got back down to his truck. After a short time driving, due to the experience, he drove into a ditch and was forced to walk home. As he got home, Bob's wife would be stunned to see him. His clothes were torn and muddy, and he had scrapes all over his body. She called the police and a doctor, and soon Bob would take the police to the site of the incident. There, the clearing had strange indentations which appeared like ladder marks. There were also indentations where the balls had rolled up Bob. Detective Con Ian Wark, a crime scene investigator and detective that worked that day, said that he had found strange marks on the ground that day. Detective Wark said there were around 32 holes, around 3.5 inches in diameter, and also marks very much like those of tracks left by bulldozers. The holes seemed to align with the proportions of the balls described by Bob. The police report from that day would indicate something that weighed tons was in the clearing. However, there were no tracks coming into the clearing, not to mention it was a difficult place for heavy machinery to access. In addition, records from companies using heavy machinery in the area didn't indicate that anything was there that day, nor did Bob's employer. Something had caused these massive indentations, but there was simply no logical explanation. In 2019, Detective Wark would tell the BBC he interviewed Bob 3 times back then, and his story stayed consistent each time. The police opened a criminal investigation into the matter, but were never able to solve it. In time, this became an incredibly popular case in Scotland and the United Kingdom, even posting a plaque where the event alleged to take place occurred. There's been many individuals who have studied the case over the years, both ufologists and skeptics. Skeptic Stuart Scamble investigated the event and believed the indentations were caused by PVC pipes laid nearby. He also stated that Bob might have had an epileptic seizure that caused him to pass out. However, neither of these explanations hold up very well to scrutiny. PVC pipes are smooth and would have left a different indentation in the area, not to mention there's no evidence that they were even stacked there. Supporters of the event taking place, including ufologist Malcolm Robinson, point out tears in Bob's pants can't really be explained by him crawling. Bob's pants were police issued and they wouldn't have been ripped from him crawling on the ground. It's important to point out as well that Bob was a respected member of the community. Bob was a war hero and an avid member of the church. There wasn't much doubt about if Bob was lying. It's just some people think he was mistaken and there might be another explanation. Still, it appears no one has been able to explain the strange indentations after all these years. While Bob could have made up or imagined the whole story, the fact is he couldn't have fabricated the physical evidence at the scene. In 2007, Bob would pass away. He never changed or wavered on his story. In December 1978, an Italian security guard would have one of the strangest alien encounters in the history of his country. In time, the man would allege he had been abducted by aliens at least 11 times. While the case sounds too far-fetched to be true, there is a surprising amount of circumstantial evidence to support this man's claims. There was physical evidence found at the scene, as well as testimony from people in the area on several occasions. His initial case garnered widespread media attention in Italy at the time, prompting media around the country to investigate. Soon, he would undergo hypnosis on live television with hundreds of thousands watching. The strange events around this man became quite controversial, and we will soon come to know why. In this episode, we will explore this unbelievable case, the story of Pier Zanfretta, and several of his alien abductions. On the night of December 6, 1978, security guard Pier Zanfretta was driving in inclement weather toward the home of a client, Dr. Ettore Ricci. The home was located in Torriglia, which is located around 20 kilometers northeast of Genoa. Around 11:30 p.m., Pier Zanfretta's life would change forever. As he arrived at the home, suddenly his car lost power. He looked out his window into the garden of the home and saw 4 strange lights. He believed it was thieves, so Zanfretta got out of his car and snuck into the garden quietly, hoping to surprise the trespassers. As he headed in, he walked next to a rock wall, hoping to stay hidden. Then, Zanfretta felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around expecting to see one of the burglars, but instead was greeted with the sight of some sort of hideous monster. Zanfretta would later describe the being as huge, at least 10 feet tall. He said it had wrinkled, greenish skin with large yellow triangular eyes and red veins across its forehead. It was also wearing something that resembled a tunic. He said the creature was hideous and repulsive. A terrified Zanfretta ran back toward his vehicle. Right as he was about to approach it, though, a bright light lit up the area. He glanced behind him and saw a massive, triangular-shaped craft. Zanfretta was blinded, but also bewildered. He couldn't get over the size of the craft, which was bigger than Dr. Ricci's home. Zanfretta then stated something hit him, some sort of heat beam, which incapacitated him. Despite this, Zanfretta, at 12:15 a.m., was able to stumble to his car and radio his superiors. Carlo Tocolino would take the call and later testify that much of the conversation was garbled. Also, when they did communicate, Zanfretta seemed terrified and was acting hysterical, leading Tocolino to believe foul play was involved and he was being assaulted. Still, it wasn't clear what was happening. For instance, Tocolino would ask who was attacking him, and Zanfretta said, "No, they aren't men. They aren't men. My God, are they ugly?" Communications then suddenly stopped, and Tocolino escalated the situation to his superiors. Another patrol was sent out. However, with the roads so icy, it would take an hour for them to arrive. 2 patrol officers, Walter Loria and Raimondo Maschia, arrived to the scene and found Zanfretta. He was lying right in front of the home on the freezing ground. When Zanfretta first spotted the security guards, he hopped up and pointed his gun at them. The 2 security guards identified themselves, but Zanfretta seemed out of it. He didn't recognize them and was acting extremely unusual. This was very strange, as Zanfretta was usually reserved and shy. His colleagues described him as a loving family man. With no other choice, the 2 guards bum-rushed Zanfretta and disarmed him. As they tackled him, they couldn't believe just how warm his body was. This made no sense, since it was freezing outside. That night, the matter would reach the Italian police force, and they would help with the investigation. They arrived on the scene, and they would soon discover something to lend support to Zanfretta's story. The grass was covered with frost that night. Behind the home, the police found 2 large indentations. They were around 9 feet in diameter and resembled horseshoes. Most notably, though, something had penetrated the frost-covered grass that night. Something heavy. Most speculate these marks came from the landing gear of the UFO. As word spread about the event, it shook the community. Pier Zanfretta was a level-headed family man, known for his integrity and honesty. Still, eventually the press got a hold of the story, and stories spread across the country around the incident. Most ridiculed him, although some looked for other explanations. One reporter that would become interested in the case was Rino Di Stefano, a journalist from Genoa who wanted to investigate the case. Unlike many of his colleagues, the case didn't make sense to him. He pondered why this family man with a good career would risk everything. In addition, over 50 residents in the area would report seeing a bright light in the direction of the site that night. They all confirmed the strange lights occurred around midnight. After several conversations with Zanfretta, Stefano would also observe just how shy he was. He certainly didn't want to be in the limelight and had been getting harassed over his story. Stefano wanted to uncover what happened to Zanfretta when he was unconscious. He suggested meeting with Dr. Mauro Moretti, a psychotherapist and member of the Italian Association of Medical Hypnosis. Dr. Moretti would perform the hypnosis, and we would learn the following in the sessions. Once under, Zanfretta alleged the hideous beings abducted him and took him someplace, which was very hot. There, they interrogated him and probed him. The beings used some sort of voice box to communicate with him. It translated whatever they were saying into Italian. The creatures would inform Zanfretta they were from a planet called Titiona. Perhaps most terrifying, the beings would tell him they would come back one day with more of their species. While this revelation was terrifying enough for Zanfretta, 3 days later he would have another horrifying abduction. Just 3 days after his hypnotic session, Zanfretta was taken again. This story is pretty incredible as well. Zanfretta claimed that he was driving his car through the Barbaglia tunnel near the Scofera Pass. Then suddenly something took control of his car. Zanfretta was panicked and radioed in his car that it was actually driving by itself. The car exited the tunnel and Zanfretta tried to brake or take control of the car. The car would go about a mile, and then once again a bright white light illuminated everything around him. He would be discovered around 1 a.m. in the morning once again. The scene was extremely strange. Sergeant Emanuele Travanzoli would find Zanfretta in a field down the road. It was pouring rain outside, yet when Travanzoli touched Zanfretta, he was warm, just like last time. His clothes were also remarkably dry. Zanfretta was said to be shaking in fear and sobbing. Perhaps even more perplexing was the conditions of the car. The top of the car was blazing hot as if it had been sitting in the sun. The officer would open the door and it was scorching hot inside. One would even describe it as the same temperature as an oven. Again, it was raining and winter at this time. Zanfretta was a mess. As the officer spoke with him, he kept saying, "They say I must leave with them. What about my children? I don't want to. I don't want to." More indentations were found at the scene too. This time though, they appeared to be footprints. His car, a Fiat, had boot prints all around it. They were massive, measuring 20 inches and about 8 inches wide. This was documented by the Italian police and remains one of the critical pieces of evidence for Zanfretta's claims. One other strange thing that happened that night was Zanfretta fired his weapon 5 times, although he can't remember discharging it. With so much criticism, and to prove he wasn't lying, Zanfretta agreed to go under hypnosis once again. This time though, the event would be televised. Hundreds of thousands watched, and during the televised event, Zanfretta would recall wearing a helmet that allowed him to communicate with them. The event was not perceived well with the public. Many believed he was lying and fabricated the whole event. A third alleged alien abduction occurred on July 30th, 1979. That night, Zanfretta would be on his motorcycle patrolling when he was taken. Zanfretta would undergo hypnosis once more. This time, though, to prove he was telling the truth, at his request, he was injected with sodium pentothal, or a truth serum. Once the truth serum kicked in, Zanfretta claims he was lifted up by a green light and entered a UFO. The truth serum gave more credibility for Zanfretta. Many experts would say it's almost impossible to lie under a truth serum. Zanfretta would go on to have more abductions and encounters. On one occasion, a man approached him at a gas station. The strange-looking man told Zanfretta to drive into a nearby cloud. Zanfretta recalled that for some reason, he obeyed the commands as if they were controlling his mind. On one other occasion, Zanfretta was taken. 4 security guards, upon approaching the area, would spot a mysterious cloud in the sky. It shot a beam of light at their car, and one of the men saw something he couldn't forget. Sadly, he would commit suicide just months later. What can we make of Pierre Zanfretta's alleged alien encounters and abductions? It's certainly an interesting one and controversial. First off, it's odd to get a case with such strange claims that seem to have some credible support. Usually, very strange cases are just one eyewitness and often only supported by hypnosis. It appears Zanfretta encountered an alien type known as reptoids, or the reptilians. These are usually widely dismissed outside UFO circles and are considered to be just conspiracy theory. Most alien abductee reports involve gray aliens or Nordics. While this case feels too strange to be true, it has an enormous amount of circumstantial evidence. On the first occasion, physical evidence was found at the scene, as well as Zanfretta's body was warm. In addition, over 50 people saw a white bright light that night. On the second abduction, there was quite a bit of physical evidence at the scene, including the hot car and a dry, warm Zanfretta. On the third case, Zanfretta alleged to be abducted under a truth serum, which is pretty difficult, maybe impossible to do. In total, there were at least 60 witnesses who claimed to have seen strange, unexplainable evidence or witnessed the bright light or craft. One man was so traumatized that sadly he chose to take his own life. Still, many speculate this was all a charade by Zanfretta. Many say that an ambitious journalist, Stefano, teamed up with Zanfretta to perpetrate the lie. Were all the details accurate from the first abduction? Perhaps a truth serum was never injected. Many questions have swirled around this case, including the credibility of the hypnosis sessions and whether we should even trust these. In addition, Zanfretta was supposed to be shy and timid, but why was he giving so many interviews and going on live television? It appears this case has no easy answers and will continue to remain controversial. In 1965, California resident Sid Patrick was taking a late-night stroll on the beach. Unable to sleep from insomnia, Sid hoped stretching his legs would finally allow him to get that elusive sleep his body desired. At home, not far away, his wife and 3 children soundly slept. As Sid was walking down the beach, he would suddenly hear a whistling sound in the sky. He looked up, and he was shocked to see the object was not a low-flying plane, but something he had never seen before. In this episode, we will examine the alien abduction of Sid Patrick, as well as his meeting with the United States Air Force. On January 30th, 1965, around 2 a.m., Sid Patrick was walking on Manresa Beach near Watsonville, California, when his life would change forever. As Sid looked up in the sky, during his walk, he saw an object of which he had never seen before. The craft up in the sky was disc-shaped, around 50 feet in diameter, and hovering around 30 feet off the ground. It began descending, coming closer to Sid, and eventually hovered just a few feet off the ground. A frightened Sid began rushing back toward his home, which was around 1,500 feet away. As he started trying to climb the sand dunes, he heard a strange voice call for him. It said, "Do not be frightened," and they were not hostile. Sid kept hustling away, and the voice persisted, stating their peaceful intentions. Eventually, Sid turned around, and the voice invited him on the ship. Sid carefully walked toward the ship, and as he got closer, a door materialized. He stepped in slowly, and a bright light shone upon him. Sid was greeted by a being that looked human in appearance. The being introduced himself as Zeno. He was around 5'10", wearing a light blue skin type suit. Zeno would then ask Sid what questions he had for it. He was scared at first, but eventually asked why they were here. Zeno stated it was for observation. Sid later speculated, though, that the beings weren't here to observe us, but actually wanted to see how Sid observed them. During the entire trip, there would be almost no questions to Sid, and it was as if they knew everything. Sid asked how they traveled so fast, and Zeno informed him their speed was determined by their energy source. It was an answer that Sid didn't quite understand. Sid would also ask how they could avoid radar detection. Zeno informed him that they were able to avoid radar as their spacecraft absorbed energy and would not allow a reflection or harmful penetration. Sid inquired if he was human. According to Zeno, the beings were human, but a different type of human than us. Zeno would go on to tell Sid he was the first person to ever enter the craft. They had invited others, but they had declined to come on board. Zeno then proceeded to guide Sid throughout the ship. They went room to room, and there were 14 other rooms, which had pale blue walls and were all oval in shape. There was light that seemed to be coming from the walls and the ceiling as well. Sid would see 8 other beings as he toured the ship. All were men, except one looked female. The beings were around 150 to 155 pounds, around 5'10", and appeared young, around the ages of 20 to 25. They wore light blue suits and appeared human, although there were differences between them and us. Their chins were more pointed than a normal human, as well as their nose. The men had dark brown, short and wavy hair, and the women had long hair that was dark brown as well. Overall, Sid described them as being very clean cut. Most of the crew appeared to be busy at their stations, navigating the ship, while Zeno spoke with Sid. They didn't pay much attention to him. Zeno would lead Sid around the craft, educating him. Zeno informed him that the beings were from a planet behind the sun. He then showed Sid a 3D image of their mothership out in space. Sid noted it was massive, maybe a mile long, shaped like a cigar and surrounded by a cloud. Zeno said it supplied the power to their craft. The craft was traveling during the tour, and Zeno informed Sid they had stopped and asked him to step out. Sid stepped outside, and he wasn't near his home, but in an abandoned campsite for trailers. Zeno wanted Sid to remember this spot so he didn't think later on he was dreaming. Sid would step out and touch the craft. The ship was very smooth and felt like plexiglass. Still, it was like nothing he had ever felt before. Later on, Sid would locate the landing site and discover that it was near Leggett, California, which is about 175 miles from his home. Zeno would tell Sid more about his planet as well. There was no crime and no sickness. Life expectancy was very long, and the beings didn't use money. They lived as one in a utopian society. Sid then re-entered the craft, and the two went into what was known as the consultation room. There, Zeno told Sid about the Supreme Being and said that the beings consulted. The Supreme Being was their God. Sid seemed to get coerced into praying toward the God by Zeno. As he kneeled and prayed, he said he was overcome with emotions of joy and happiness. It was a euphoria that he never felt before. It was so intense he had to rest afterwards in a chair for some time. Around 4 a.m., Sid was returned to his home. Unlike many other alien abductees, Sid didn't appear to become traumatized by the event. In fact, he wanted answers and would call the U.S. Air Force the day he came home. After his call, he would meet for a debrief. For 3 hours, a team headed by Major Damon Reeder from Hamilton Air Force Base drilled him with questions. They told Sid the beings were dangerous and hostile and that he should have ran. Interestingly, they cited several cases where UFOs had attacked aircraft and killed pilots. One of the cases they mentioned, the Thomas Mantell incident, we covered on a prior episode on this channel. The Air Force would continue telling Sid there were different races of aliens visiting the Earth and that he should refrain from telling his story. In the years that followed, according to Sid, he continued to have contact with Zeno. On one occasion, when Sid went to Seattle to give a speech, Zeno sent him flowers. It's not clear to what extent Sid had contact with them, but the one thing clear is he had a positive experience. In fact, it's probably more accurate to label him an experiencer and not an abductee. Experiencers are different than alien abductees in that they were happy about their abduction and many times would do it again. Some believe that these individuals are brainwashed and the beings have planted thoughts in their minds. Others think it's a case of Stockholm Syndrome. It's important to point out there appears to be different types of aliens visiting the planet. Some appear to be benevolent, while others not so much. The case of Sid Patrick is surely a fascinating one and seems pretty valid. Perhaps the most valid reason for this is that later on, Sid was able to find the landing site for the UFO. This was a place he had never been to before. In addition, since he wasn't taken while sleeping, it seems highly unlikely that he imagined the event. It could be the case he made up the whole story, but it seems unlikely. This is because in 1965, making a report like this is just inviting trouble into your life. The military was not happy with him, and a report like this would certainly lead to being outcast in society. In addition, UFO investigators like Timothy Cook, who studied the case and listened to his audio recordings, noted how precise, consistent, and quick his answers were with investigators. There was no waffling or hesitation in his answers. Sid Patrick eventually retreated from the spotlight due to the constant harassment, yet his case continues to be studied and analyzed to date. On November 21st, 2003, a small Kentucky farming community would experience a strange and unprecedented event. Many in the community would report hearing a woman screaming for help. After several residents called 911, police and first responders combed the area where the yelling had occurred. However, they couldn't locate the source of the screams, which occurred in an open field. Just moments earlier, In the same field, several residents spotted a UFO landing. In this episode, we will examine the strange and terrifying 2003 Kentucky screaming sounds. In late November 2003, the National UFO Reporting Center would receive a report detailing the strange screaming sounds and the UFO sightings. According to the report, around 9 to 10 p.m. on November 21st, just outside Moorhead, Kentucky, a series of high-pitched screams could be heard. They sounded like a woman yelling, "Help me! Oh God, help me!" After a series of phone calls to 911, emergency responders rushed to search the area. They found nothing there, but just moments prior, the same area was the site of a UFO landing. Individuals at the National UFO Reporting Center were quite intrigued by the story, but there was just one problem. The report was submitted by someone anonymous. As a result, UFO investigator Kenny Young began taking it upon himself to track down and interview witnesses to the event. Initially, the police department appeared to get irritated when being asked about the night in question. The investigation stalled in the beginning, with no one willing to go on record and many refusing to talk. Interestingly, based on the writing style, the report submitted to the National UFO Reporting Center appears to have been written by either a police officer or emergency responder. 9 days after the event, Young was able to track down a credible witness who would go on record. Dr. Virgil Davis was a University of Kentucky college professor who saw the UFO, and his sons heard the woman scream. Dr. Davis recalls that on the night of November 21st, he was driving home with his 15 and 18-year-old sons in the car. They saw an oval-shaped, white-colored object hovering over an open field near their home. The object was hovering silently. It would then drop quickly and stop. Then once again it would drop quickly and stop once again. After a few minutes passed, it began moving around more randomly in the sky. Dr. Davis and his sons got out of the car during the time to get a better look. At this point, they thought it could be something else. However, eventually the three came to the conclusion that this was indeed an unidentified flying object. As such, they got in the car and began heading home. They were somewhat worried that the beings may have spotted them and they could be in danger. A few minutes later, they arrived at the home and went up to the second story. There, they looked out the window and spotted the UFO again. At this point, it was descending closer to the ground, and the color changed from white to orange. It got bigger as it came closer toward the ground and turned reddish eventually. Dr. Davis couldn't be 100% sure if it actually touched the ground, as some trees were blocking his point of view. While all this was occurring, Dr. Davis recalled that it was almost complete silence outside. However, once it changed to red, the silence broke. At that time, all the animals went crazy. His German Shepherd tried to break its chain and run off. After a few minutes, either on the ground or close to it, the red object then quickly ascended and shot off into the sky. From here, though, the story gets more bizarre. After the UFO disappeared, Dr. Davis's two sons went outside and heard the screaming sounds of a female yelling for help where the UFO just landed. The sons rushed over in their car to the area and called the police on the way. Others had called them as well, and soon there were dozens of officers and a helicopter over the field where the UFO was spotted. Dr. Davis would have an officer come to his door 20 minutes after the UFO left. Dr. Davis told the officer he had seen a UFO, and the officer stated he had seen one as well that night. The big mystery in this case surrounds the screaming sounds. They were heard directly in the field where the UFO landed after the sighting, yet no woman was ever found. While it's possible that no woman was yelling or that it's not connected to the UFO, several theories have formed regarding what the scream could have been. The first is that the woman was screaming as she was an alien abductee. Perhaps the beings were experimenting on her. Still, there's all sorts of questions around the alien abductee theory and its possibility. This is because the scream was heard after the craft left. Maybe, though, another spaceship, perhaps one naked to the human eye, was still present at the scene. One theory is that the beings were from another dimension. As they stepped into the other world, somehow the woman's scream carried over to our world. The flaw in this theory, though, is once again, Dr. David saw the craft fly away. A third theory is that the screams came from some sort of sound delay. We know these advanced beings are able to manipulate space-time in ways we can't begin to understand. Was the sound from inside the craft at a past time and somehow the scream got delayed? Or perhaps even from the future? The possibilities here are endless, and it's really tough for humans to imagine. The fourth theory is that the witnesses misheard something. This could be the most likely scenario, and possibly the witnesses heard a noise that sounded like a woman's scream. Regardless if the woman's scream occurred or not, the UFO sighting definitely appears to have happened. The question around the woman screaming is certainly an intriguing one. If it had occurred while the craft was near the ground, almost certainly the consensus view would be it was an abductee inside the ship. However, since it didn't, we'll almost never be certain who was screaming and why. Perhaps, though, it's better we don't know the answer to that question. On May 15, 1957, a soldier serving in the U.S. Army Occupation Force in Salzburg, Austria, would have a bizarre and terrifying experience. When returning home one night on a walk, the soldier alleged to encounter an extraterrestrial. In addition, the entity paralyzed the man, abducted him, and took him to a strange planet. The story seems almost certainly like science fiction, yet the case seems almost too strange to be fabricated. In this episode, we will examine this unbelievable case known as the 1951 Salzburg, Austria alien abduction. On the night of May 15, 1957, the aforementioned soldier, who wished to remain anonymous, had just finished his duties for the night. The soldier was responsible for driving Quartermaster Colonel Cousin. That night, the soldier dropped off his car at the base and began walking home. He would choose to take a shortcut through a wooded area. Then, around 11:20 p.m., the soldier spotted something moving towards him. He couldn't make out what it was or who specifically because there was no moon that night and it was extremely dark with no other light sources. Still, the soldier believed that it was a person, not an animal, as the shape of the object moving towards him resembled a person. Then the soldier noticed that the figure was holding something in its hand. It was a long, thin, pencil-like device, and the figure began pointing it at him. The soldier tried lifting his hand in front of his face to protect himself from the device. However, when he tried to lift his arm, he realized that he was paralyzed. Then, in a matter of seconds, the mysterious being placed a black square plate on his chest and wrapped it around his back. Still paralyzed, the soldier could see the figure walking around him, but couldn't see specific details of it. Then it finally stopped in front of him and pointed the pencil-like device directly at the black square plate. The entity began walking away, and the soldier somehow was being pulled along with him. It was as if the entity had put a leash on the soldier. Still, according to the soldier, he wasn't in the air floating, but somehow his body mass had significantly decreased. the being would pull him out into a small field. In the field, there was a craft around 150 feet in diameter. The being would levitate, bringing the soldier with him, and the two ascended over the craft. Then underneath them, a door opened inside. The two would float downwards, and at this point the soldier could finally make out specifics on the entity. The soldier noticed that this was definitely no human. The being was around 5 feet tall in a dark suit. The torso was shaped like a can. The being had no neck, with short arms and 3 to 4 fingers, which were very long. The soldier could see through the helmet, and its head was white. It had large eyes, similar to a fly, and also 2 holes for a nose. The mouth was just a horizontal slit. After a few seconds of descending, the soldier would feel his feet finally touch the ground. The room he was in was transparent, and he could see the stars through the wall and the ceilings. The being would then pull him into another room. As he entered, the strange entity clicked the pencil-like device, and the paralysis ended. At that point, the craft began ascending, and the soldier watched through the transparent floor, the ground getting further and further away. Soon, looking outside the transparent walls, the soldier could see he was in space. A little while later, the soldier would regain his strength. In time, sunlight began to enter the craft. Gradually, the amount of sunlight increased, and then unexpectedly, the soldier began to feel the effects of the sun. The being would take notice, pull some levers on the wall, and a blue, gel-like substance would cover the ceiling and the walls, protecting the soldier somehow. A few seconds later, the soldier would feel the craft move again. He believed that they were headed back towards Earth, but as he looked out, he noticed that Earth was getting smaller and smaller. The craft was moving so fast that Earth soon vanished from his sight. The soldier would notice new planets, and soon the craft stopped and began descending to an unknown planet. As the craft descended, what the soldier saw was truly strange. He reported seeing fields of red, and in these fields what he described as large chimneys. He described the chimneys as something the beings developed, although he wasn't sure what their purpose was. There were several bright blue rivers. The landscape was gorgeous, according to the soldier, and he described it as looking like paradise. The craft would eventually settle in one of the red fields. It descended, and the soldier noticed other crafts in the red field just like the one he was in, although some were different colors. As the craft landed, the being would head over to another ship. The soldier then walked outside the craft and was stunned to see the other UFOs had humans. Then the being began returning to the craft, and the soldier quickly re-entered. As the being came in, the craft ascended, and the ship quickly took off at incredible speeds. Soon, the soldier would see planet Earth. The craft then descended toward the ground and landed in the same spot where the soldier was abducted. The soldier was released, and from the ground, he watched as the craft took off into the night sky. This report was first documented in an article in the Prince George Citizen, a newspaper out of British Columbia, Canada. It was published on December 11th, 1957, around 7 months after the event. Astonishingly, the soldier, when he returned, looked at his watch and realized that he was only gone for 10 minutes. What can we make of this extremely strange story? This case appears to have many components that fall outside typical UFO sightings, alien encounters, and alien abductions. The entity seen is not one of the typical aliens reported, such as gray or Nordic aliens. Still, it should be said that many cases involve extraterrestrials that are not typically reported. In addition, It should be stated that there are other alien abduction reports where individuals report transparent walls and transparent ceilings. Also, many times, alien abductees report seeing other humans or beings that at least look like humans on the craft with them. Skeptics will quickly point out that the story comes from an anonymous witness. This is a valid point, but it's important to point out in the 1950s a person who publicly discussed an event like this would surely be met with ridicule. In addition, it would be devastating for their career. It's a bit unusual for someone to report being taken to another planet. Most alien abduction cases involve abductees remaining on the craft. Still, one has to wonder how a story like this could be fabricated. Did the Canadian newspaper simply create the story to sell more newspapers? This is one possibility that should be acknowledged. That said, there are a number of unbelievable alien encounters and alien abduction stories that have been recorded. Some believe that the more strange alien encounters and alien abductions are the most credible. This is because other alleged cases usually copy prior reports. Perhaps that is what happened in this case. In Mexico, 1981, a photographer would spot something strange in the sky and snap several photos. Little did he know, his life would change forever after that day. After the event, the man would spot the UFO later and eventually make contact with the beings. While his story surely sounds like science fiction, the UFO photos taken have been investigated thoroughly and have been deemed highly credible. In this episode, we will examine the strange alien abduction of Carlos Diaz, as well as the photos he took. In the early morning hours of January 1981, Carlos Diaz, a photographer, drove into Ajusco National Forest, located just outside Tepoztlan, Mexico. Diaz pulled his car in a parking lot in the dark, and there waited for a journalist who he would be working with on the assignment. As Diaz waited in his humid car in the darkness, he suddenly spotted something strange up in the air. There was an orange bright light over the hill around 100 feet from his car. Diaz believed initially that it was a forest fire. However, as he looked closer, it clearly was not. Diaz grabbed his camera sitting next to him and snapped several photos of the strange orange light. At that point, the car started shaking and shut off. Diaz hopped out of the car and shot 2 more photos of the object. Next, a stunned Diaz watched as the craft sped off into the sky. While this story in of itself is fascinating, this is just the beginning of the Carlos Diaz story. In the ensuing weeks, Diaz kept thinking about his sighting and experience, and eventually he kept returning to the spot in hopes of seeing and photographing the craft again. For weeks he tried, and then finally, on March 23rd, 1981, his luck would change. While hiking, he would spot the bright orange oval craft again. It was raining and foggy, so he didn't have a great view of it, so he decided to hike closer to the object to improve his vantage point. He eventually managed to get quite close and positioned himself just under the craft. It was around 100 feet above him, and Diaz decided to stay hidden behind some rocks. Diaz was able to make out more details on the craft at this point as well. It had semicircles all over it and a smooth ring around the center. While watching it, suddenly someone grabbed his shoulder from behind. Diaz passed out, and strangely, when he woke up, his clothes were all dry, even though it had just been raining. He knew that something had happened to him, but he wasn't sure what. Diaz began walking to his car, and when he reached it, he would see a strange being. The being had white blonde hair pale skin, and fit the description of a Nordic alien, the entity would converse with Diaz and tell him if he wanted to know what had happened to him, that he should return tomorrow around noon. The next day, Diaz returned and saw the entity sitting on the grass. The being would speak to Diaz and tell him that he was the one who grabbed his shoulder. He had descended from the craft, down to the ground. It went on to say his memories of what had happened to him would return over time. As time progressed, Diaz's memories would come back. Diaz would recall the day he fainted that the craft had descended down toward him. With the bright orange light right above him, Diaz reached out his hand and touched the craft. His hand seemed to get absorbed by the bright light, and the next thing he remembered was waking up in a gigantic cave. The craft was parked near him, and the cave was filled with massive stalagmites and, surprisingly, what looked like other people. The being with Diaz would lead him out of the massive cave and into a smaller one. In there would be 7 yellow egg-shaped orbs. Diaz was asked to step in one of the orbs, and when he did, he could feel the environment of Ajusco National Forest. He couldn't touch anything, and the being informed him that the orbs were used to store information about different habitats. Diaz then came out of the orb and was returned back. This, according to Diaz, wasn't the end of his contact with the beings, though. He would continue to communicate with them. The case of Carlos Diaz and the photographs taken by him have been investigated by several different researchers, and the results show Diaz's case to be highly credible. Jamie Mawson, a famous Mexican UFO researcher, has stated that Diaz's photos are among the best he has ever seen. Mawson had the photos looked at by several experts. One was Professor Victor Quesada at the Polytechnical Institute of the University of Mexico. Quesada said they were shocked to discover that the spectrum of light from the object was unlike anything they had ever seen. He stated it didn't match anything in their databanks and the light was extraordinarily intense. They concluded there was no evidence of superimposition or it being a hoax. They estimated the object to be around 90 to 150 feet in diameter. In addition, Mawson interviewed Diaz and believed that his story was genuine. Mawson would also speak with others in the community around Ajusco National Forest. Interestingly, some stated they had seen a strange, orange glowing object in the sky. Michael Hessman, a German ufologist, would interview Diaz, and he found his story to be credible too. In his report, he noted that Diaz was in constant contact with the beings, and Diaz believed that they were living among us. John Mack, a professor at Harvard Medical School, looked into the case and stated he believed it was one of the most convincing he has ever came across. Robert Nathan, a UFO skeptic who worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, examined the photo as well and believed it was real. This case is well known inside the UFO community, but not as well known outside it. With solid photographic evidence and even video evidence, this raises the question why. We suspect that the claims made by Diaz in his story have led many to cast doubt on his story despite the intriguing photographs. While this case has been extensively researched over the years, by all accounts Diaz continued his contact with the beings. It is said he became more connected to the environment and since has become a proponent of saving the environment. According to Diaz, humanity was on a path toward total destruction, and the entities believed it was almost certain to happen. Some skeptics claim that Diaz, being a photographer, manipulated the photos. He would have had the skill set to do so and create this orange oval object. However, according to the analysis done on the photos, in the first photo you can see the reflection of the windshield in the photo. Allegedly, there is also video evidence of the craft appearing in the sky. In sum, it doesn't seem possible that someone in the early 1980s would be able to fake evidence like this. Like other cases, Diaz appeared to be in contact with tall whites or Nordics. These beings have been reported in numerous alien encounters and abductions. Some believe these beings walk among us as well. Today, even if photos like this were taken, they would be quickly dismissed as deep fakes. This, in some ways, makes finding proof tougher than ever. In March 1944, a Swedish man would have a frightening alien abduction experience. The man wrote a letter in 1985 to journalist Vera Norling, who worked for the Hemmet-Journal in Sweden. In his letter, he detailed a strange alien encounter and alien abduction he experienced in 1944. Seemingly, the man had his memory of the incident wiped for decades. Then, in 1984, a bizarre experience reminded him of what happened that day and pushed the man to tell his story. In this episode, we will examine this 1944 alien abduction that occurred in Klissberget, Sweden. Around 6 a.m. in the morning in March 1944, the man, who wished to remain anonymous, packed his ski gear and headed from nearby Sundsvall to Klissberget. Klissberget is a wooded mountain that sits in the central eastern part of the country. The mountain is popular among outdoor enthusiasts for its skiing, mountain biking, and hiking. After arriving and ascending the mountain around 3 kilometers, the man put on his skis and began skiing down the mountain. As he was going down, the man saw something truly strange. A silver, spherical craft around 20 to 25 feet in diameter was sitting on the ground to his right, just down the mountain. The man was mesmerized and stopped skiing. He took off his skis and began walking toward it as if he was in a trance. As he continued walking under the craft, unexpectedly, the craft pulled him upward. Then, the man found himself in a room with extraterrestrials. There were 3 of them, and they were wearing loose-fitting, yellow clothes. The beings were around 4 feet tall and had some type of gray helmet that blocked their face. The man looked around the craft and saw all sorts of dashboards and lights, seemingly to navigate the ship. As he thought to himself how foreign it looked, suddenly he heard a voice in his head say, "From the outside." The man was then told telepathically by the extraterrestrials they were going to take samples. The man refused, but was forced down onto a table and was restrained. Next, the beings would perform extremely invasive experiments on the man, some being too graphic for YouTube. Some of the less invasive ones include the beings collecting saliva and attaching wires and tubes to his body. Eventually, being in so much pain, the man would pass out. Later, the man would wake up after some time on the table with a terrible pain in his groin. He was then guided to an elevator and lowered back down to where he was taken originally. Telepathically, the man was told he would be okay and that he would fully recover from the experiments. The craft would then silently ascend and disappear quickly into the sky. Despite what the beings told him, the man would suffer health issues in the following years. Due to a high fever, he had to take 2 weeks off work right after the incident. It got so high at one point that he passed out while just outside his home. Pretty soon after the event, the man seemed to forget the incident had occurred strangely. Then something happened in October 1974 that pushed the man to write the letter 1 year later in 1975. On October 24th, around 9 a.m. in the morning, the man was watching TV when something terrifying happened. The man was reading a newspaper when he noticed the TV turned on by itself. There were images of a forest, and then shockingly, he saw himself skiing down the mountain back in March 1944. Stunned, he watched as he skied down and then walked toward the craft. Soon, he heard a voice inside his head. It stated, "Look carefully. Do you recognize this?" The TV would then show the beings experimenting on him. Then they would state telepathically, "We want you on our side. Do you want to come over to us? We can multiply your life expectancy. There are more of your kind here, and no one shows any regrets." The man adamantly stated no. Then he would hear, "We will be back." This frightened the man, as he thought he might be taken again. The man would then write his letter to journalist Vera Norling, detailing the story in 1975. It's not clear why he waited until 1975, but after the TV incident, it clearly disturbed him. In 1975, after sending the letter, the man would swap several phone calls with Norling. During the calls, he would explain he didn't want to reveal his identity, as he didn't want to deal with the public scrutiny. Furthermore, he didn't want his family to suffer the embarrassment. He would also state he had forgotten the event over the years until that day in 1974 when the TV turned on by itself. After the last conversation, he would send one more letter to Norling, stating that he had placed a brown letter in his safety deposit box. On the letter it states, "To be opened after my death." The letter details his experience and is addressed to his family. No family member has ever come forward regarding the letter. Based on the age of the event, he is more than likely deceased by now, so we will probably never know who read the letter and who the man was. It is possible he removed the letter, but more than likely the family read it and decided to keep his identity secret. What can we make of this case? It is surely a fascinating one. While the case relies solely on one anonymous witness, it seems extremely strange and unlikely that someone would fabricate this story. What would be the motivation for someone to do this? We surely cannot verify the story, nor the person's identity, but the circumstantial evidence clearly leads us to believe that this event likely did happen. We know that claiming to see a UFO or to be abducted by aliens would definitely be met with harsh criticism and ridicule. In his letter, the man appears to be very distraught he can't go public. His last sentence in his letter states, "All of this is true." Many characteristics of this case are very common with other alien abductions as well. The man was communicated with through telepathy. The UFO was typical of many sightings, being spherical and gray. The beings were small, like many other reported sightings in alien abductions. In addition, the experience appeared to get wiped from his memory, like other cases we have examined on this channel. One interesting aspect of this case is the decision given to him to go with the beings. It's interesting that he was given a choice and not forced to go. Perhaps extraterrestrials don't want individuals who will be defiant and tough to control. We will probably never know who this man was and whether further abductions continued. However, the circumstances surrounding this case seem to indicate that something did happen on that mountain that day. On October 27th, 1974, around 10 p.m., just outside Essex, England, a family of 5 would have an experience they would never forget. 29-year-old John Abbas, his wife Elaine, then aged 25, and their 3 children were driving home after visiting Elaine's parents. On the drive home, the family spotted an oval pale blue light on their left-hand side up in the sky. What happened next to the family was truly frightening and changed their lives forever. In this episode, we will explore the bizarre alien abduction of John Avis and his family. As John and his family were driving back home to Aveley, Essex, 2 children were asleep in the back, and their oldest, Kevin, was awake. As the family traveled down the rural road, they spotted a pale blue light on the left-hand side up in the sky. They would notice soon that the light appeared to be following their car on the dark road. As the family rounded a curve, they were terrified to discover that the pale blue light had turned and kept following them. The family kept driving down the road, and at this time the light seemed to hide. Then, around 500 yards away, the family would spot the light hovering directly over the road. They continued driving toward the light, and soon a strange green mist began covering the entire road. Right as they entered the mist, the radio on the car started breaking up, and eventually it heated and started smoking as if it was going to catch on fire. John began pulling wires from it in order to disable it. Then the car headlights went out and the engine died on the car. The mist was extremely thick and they couldn't see through it. It was around 8 to 10 feet tall, and inside it was freezing cold, and the family struggled to stay awake. Eerily, the sounds of nature disappeared, and they were in complete silence. Then, after what felt like a few seconds, the green mist vanished. At this time, the car was in a different location, around half a mile down the same road. The couple kept driving, and they were terrified to realize that as they got home, it was around 1 a.m. They had lost 3 hours of time. The family tried to initially move on from the incident. However, whatever happened to them that night proved to be too much. John had a nervous breakdown just before Christmas that year and stopped working. Strange and scary things began happening all around the family. The family began hearing loud noises at night that sounded like a drone hovering above their home. People outside the family, like Elaine's sister, would hear them as well. In the living room, the family would report hearing clicking noises. Electrical devices began acting strange, like the television. One frightening story concerns what happened to one of John's children, Kevin. The child woke up and saw a man standing next to his bed, dressed like a clown. It was wearing almost all white. The family appeared to be followed by someone or something. Strange cars would sit outside their home and watch the family. It is thought that this was the Men in Black, and they were checking to ensure the family didn't report the incident. The situation got so serious that John called the police several times. In addition to the stalking and strange noises, the family's health habits began to change drastically. Perhaps not a negative thing, both John and Elaine gave up drinking alcohol. John gave up smoking, although he was a heavy smoker who had been smoking 3 to 4 packs a day. There didn't appear to be any natural reason why these habits changed, though. In addition to their health habits changing, both John and Elaine started having strange dreams. Elaine recalled lying on an operating table with a small being in a white coat experimenting on her. She also remembered standing next to her car, along with John and one of her children in a large room. Inside the room, there were men in gray one-piece suits walking around. John had similar dreams and recalled being operated by something that resembled a gnome. Interestingly, years earlier, in 1968, John stated he saw a UFO and it made the engines of several cars die, nearly causing a massive collision on the freeway. Fed up the way things were going, John and Elaine eventually agreed to go under hypnosis. They were hesitant at first, but they realized they needed to understand what happened to them. They agreed to meet with UFO researcher Andrew Collins. Collins would bring along several other UFO researchers and also a hypnotherapist, Dr. Leonard Wilder. Dr. Wilder, the hypnotherapist, would perform the hypnotic regression. Under hypnosis, John recalled that as the car went into the thick green mist, a white beam hit the car and lifted it. He would then enter a large room and was separated from his family. There were two types of beings. The first was tall, with pink eyes and one-piece suits. They communicated with John by telepathy and told him not to be concerned about his family. These appeared to be in charge as another being examined him. The smaller being had pointed eyes, a nose, pointed ears, hunched shoulders, and a white coat. When John asked where they had came from, the tall being said they didn't need to say, as they were not going to ever return. The beings did note they didn't have a reason for being here, as they have always been here. Soon, John was put on a metallic table and several instruments were used on him. John asked the beings where they came from and how they got here. As they explained the science, John could not understand the mechanics of how they first arrived on Earth. They also noted, once again, that they had no reason to return home. John later said, after the hypnotism sessions, that he believed that many of his thoughts were being blocked by the beings. Elaine recalled under hypnosis that after they entered the craft, her husband was separated from her and her children. Then Elaine was separated from the children. Elaine was extremely upset, and the beings assured her that they would be okay. Still very distressed, Elaine was taken into a large room where she would be examined. In the room, she would be strapped down to a table against her will. Still upset as she was strapped down and trying to fight, one of the beings told her telepathically that she needed to calm down or they wouldn't be able to examine her. After refusing, the tall entity came over and placed their hand on her forehead, and Elaine blacked out. In order to relax Elaine, the beings offered her some type of food which she believed had some sort of sedative in it. After Elaine declined, they began playing some type of music which Elaine recalled relaxed her. At this time, Elaine recalled the being saying, "Your children are safe. You value your children. We do not reproduce. We do not have children. We reproduce through you. You are our children." After the examinations under hypnosis, both John and Elaine recall being shown around the craft. After their tour, they would lie down, and the beings would tell them to look up at a screen. On the screen, a series of images would be on display. They popped up rapidly, and the beings began communicating inside both Elaine and John's head. The entities went on to say that their planet had been destroyed by pollution. They were here now for good. The Avis case is certainly a fascinating one. The case has common characteristics seen in many alien abductions, but also some traits not routinely seen. For instance, in many alien abduction cases, abductees report missing time. Also, it's well known that many abductees report being experimented on against their will. There are several characteristics, though, that are not typically seen. For one, the appearance of the beings appears to be very unique. This doesn't cast doubt on their story, but typically most abductees report either gray aliens or Nordics. Unfortunately, this case relies heavily on hypnotherapy, and many are skeptical in cases like this. One interesting aspect of this case is that it appears that paranormal activity, or poltergeist activity, could have been happening in the family's home. This raises the interesting question around why the paranormal would be attracted to alien abductees. Of course, this could as well be the beings monitoring the family after the alleged abduction. Did this case occur, though? It seems there are arguments for both sides. As mentioned, the case relies heavily on hypnotherapy. However, there does appear to be many strange things that happened to this family. For one, their health habits changing is very interesting. Also, they experienced several hours of missing time. By all accounts, this family was able to move on with their lives and didn't experience any adverse effects from this event, nor any more contact. In Bayamon, Puerto Rico, in 1979, two women would have a terrifying experience. A young woman named Miriam and her mother named Sonia were driving on Puerto Rico Highway 2 when a bright bluish light would engulf their car. The women would lose 2.5 hours of time and end up in Arecibo, a town located around 70 kilometers away. In time, the memories of what happened to these women would be uncovered and would truly shock them. In this episode, we will examine the 1979 Bayamon, Puerto Rico alien abduction. In the summer of 1979, around 7 p.m., Miriam was driving with Sonia in the passenger seat. The two were traveling down Highway 2, which runs parallel to the coastline. Sometime while driving, Miriam and Sonia recalled that day suddenly turned into night. Then a mist surrounded the car along with a bluish white light. A humming began, and at this point Miriam was confused, while Sonia appeared to be in a state of shock. Something strange was happening, but what was it? Miriam reported the car began to feel like it lifted off the ground. Then a second white bright light entered the car on the right-hand side. It engulfed her mother, and as Miriam watched in horror, she vanished into the thin air. Miriam looked out the window and saw a huge metallic silver craft hovering above them. A few seconds later, Miriam was then surrounded by the same bright light. Incredibly, she found herself begin to levitate and go straight up through the car roof. She looked down and she saw herself and the car were both very high off the ground. As she looked up at the craft, a door began to open and a strange being was there. The entity she described as having grayish-whitish skin, around 6 feet tall, and having a large head with dark eyes. The being had long arms with long fingers, a small nose, and a mouth. Miriam would recall that it looked friendly. It began to communicate with Miriam telepathically and invited her inside, telling her not to be afraid. As she came into the craft, Miriam was assured that she would be safe and not have to worry. Inside the craft, it was silverish white, and Miriam would spot several small beings around 3.5 feet tall that resembled gray aliens. Miriam was guided to a round chamber where more small grays were. The chamber had a seat that came out from the wall. In the middle of the room, there was a metallic table. Next to it, a small table was there with an assortment of metallic instruments and strange objects. Miriam would state that she had never seen many of the objects on that table. At this point, they began to probe Miriam. Several different rods were put in her, and the beings said they would help her energy levels. As this was occurring, Miriam felt a rush of energy through her body. Several grays were monitoring her on a computer-like machine. She was told she had bone cancer, but the beings informed her that they had cured her. Another device was put on her forehead, and she was told that the test would allow them to examine deep into her consciousness. Right after this occurred, the tall being explained their purpose. According to it, the entities watch over their world and also others. As he was telepathically telling her this, the being began to light up, and Miriam was consumed with feelings of love for the being. The being also stated that members of their race were in contact with governments around the world. The entity, still engulfed in the light, would transform into a human-looking creature. Based on Miriam's description, the being looked like a Nordic alien. The two would then look out the window, and according to the being, they were looking at the Swiss Alps. After this, Miriam would wake up in her car alongside her mother. Oddly, the two were driving and confused. They had forgot about day suddenly turning into night. Also, they were miles ahead on the road, and it was nighttime. Miriam would remember what happened after seeing the white-bluish light through hypnotic therapy. There are many who criticize the use of hypnotherapy. It's said to be able to uncover repressed memories. However, critics of it argue that it can produce false memories as well. Sonia would go through hypnotic regression too. She would state under hypnosis, after the bluish light, an odd sound came, and she saw the craft in the sky as well. The light came from beneath the craft. She would be taken onto it by a small gray, and once inside, she would see several tall beings, some with blonde hair. Much of what she recalled seemed to match Miriam's story. However, it could easily be the case the two colluded on the story. What can we make of this strange event? There are several characteristics that are seen in many alien abduction stories. One, they were abducted through a light and entered a craft, described by many. The beings also seem to match many alien abduction stories. Lost time is a characteristic we see often in these cases. Perhaps the strangest aspect of this case has to do with what Miriam was told. While it's possible she may have misheard or misinterpreted the being's message, there are other cases where beings claim to be divine. There's different schools of thought as to why this happens, but it has been seen in other alleged alien abduction cases. While many dismiss the case as pure fiction, it seems odd that both a mother and daughter might choose to create a story like this. It could be the case, though. They were hoping to gain fame and ultimately money. Unfortunately, this extraordinary story has really no physical evidence to support it. Perhaps there is something, though, but the women have not disclosed it and have chose to move on with their lives. On September 23, 1978, two Argentinians were participating in a cross-continent car race known as Round South America. As the two men were racing and were just north of the city of Carmen de Patagones, they would notice a yellow light in the rearview mirror. Soon, though, the light would get closer and the men would have an experience they would never forget. In this episode, we will look at the strange events that happened to the two drivers, 38-year-old Carlos Acevedo and 28-year-old Miguel Angel Moya. In the early morning hours on September 23, 1978, the men were driving and had about 600 miles left in the race. Around 2 a.m., the men decided to stop and refuel in the city of Viedma. They filled their primary tank, which held 50 liters, and also a reserve tank, which held 40 liters. After 30 minutes at the station, conversing with others, the men left the gas station, with Carlos driving and Miguel in the passenger seat. Then, around 3 a.m., the men were driving on a dark, empty highway. they had passed through the city of Carmen de Patagones and were around 20 miles north of the city. Unexpectedly, the men spotted a bright, yellow light in the rearview mirror in the distance. After a few minutes, it began getting closer to the car, and the yellow dot began growing larger and larger. At the time, the men were driving well over 60 miles per hour. Despite this, the light kept getting closer and closer, and soon was almost right behind them. The men believed it was a newer type of race car and began driving on the far right side of the road to allow it to pass easier. Then the light came even closer behind the car and began to illuminate it. It was extremely bright, yellow in color, with small amounts of purple. At this time, something took control of the car. The car was moving forward, but Carlos couldn't tell if he was controlling it. Carlos looked out the window at the ground and was shocked to see the car was off the ground. It was around 6 feet in the air and hovering through it. Even more frightening, the vehicle began levitating higher and higher in the sky. Carlos would later say he was not 100% sure if the engine was on at the time, but he thinks that it wasn't. At this time, Carlos looked out the window again, but all he could see was the blinding of the bright light. Carlos stressed the light was so bright he couldn't see the hood of their car, nor could he even see the dash or his hand right in front of his face. At this time, Miguel was sitting completely frightened. He couldn't speak or move. It's not clear if this was caused by sheer terror or the beings forcing him into the trance. He also said he felt that the light was smothering him. He looked over at Carlos, and he looked like he was screaming, but Miguel couldn't hear anything. He then tried to open the door, but according to Miguel, it was seemingly glued shut. The men inside the light would lose all concept of time. The men seemed to forget what happened to them next, but at some point the men woke up on the side of the road. They looked to the side, and in the distance, a bright yellow light shot up into the night. Miguel immediately felt pressure on his chest and had problems breathing. After some time, he would regain his strength. Both Carlos and Miguel rested for some time, and then Carlos started the car again and continued onward. After around 15 minutes, the men stopped in Pedro Luro at a gas station, which was around 80 miles north of Carmen de Patagones. The odometer, though, showed only an additional 32 miles. According to their notes, the odometer was 44 miles short of the distance between Pedro Luro and Carmen de Patagones. Even more strange, they had arrived in Pedro Luro at 5:10 a.m. If the men had been traveling at around 60 miles per hour, their typical speed, then it shouldn't have taken them more than 75 minutes. In reality, it took 2.5 hours to reach Pedro Luro. The odometer didn't make any sense. The men had been logging kilometers traveled and where the odometer was at specific times. Perhaps even more strange, the men noted that their 40-liter reserve tank was completely emptied, even though the men had just filled it and didn't empty it themselves at any point. The two men would report the incident to the Pedro Ludo Police Department and speak with Daniel Osimi. Osimi would document the men seemed mentally fit but extremely agitated and nervous. UFO investigator Guillermo C. Roncoran would investigate the event. He would note both accounts were very similar and the witnesses seemed well-intentioned. The gas station worker in Pedro Ludo, named Hector Forchada, was interviewed, and it was found that he remembered the men, especially Miguel, and both the men seemed shaken up. He recalled the men discussing the instruments in the car and whether they had malfunctioned. Even more interesting, Hector told investigators that night he had heard reports of a strange bright yellow light in the sky in a nearby city. One other interesting fact from that night concerns other cars that were in the race and behind Carlos and Miguel. No other cars recall passing their car along the road. Again, the trip from the north part of Carmen de Patagones to Pedro Luro should have taken no more than 70 minutes, yet it took over 2 hours. Admittedly, it could be the case the men simply pulled the car over and hid in the dark, but it seems unlikely given how nervous and agitated they were. Carlos Acevedo was born in Argentina, but his parents were Chilean. Carlos had 3 children and was described as being financially well as he owned several shoe stores. Around a month before the event occurred, on August 17, 1978, Carlos and Hugo Proms would depart the city of Buenos Aires for the race. Carlos would start the race with Hugo Proms, but shortly after, Hugo would drop out of the race and Miguel would fill his spot. Miguel was born and raised in Santiago, Chile. Said to be quiet and reserved, Miguel worked as a mechanic, and according to Carlos, he was one of the best in the business. In 1999, a Chilean TV show called OVNI, Spanish for UFO, featured the case. On the show, it was said that Miguel experienced hallucinations as he was falling asleep after the event. While this case is based solely on eyewitness testimony, it has many characteristics of both UFO encounters and alien abductions. The men witnessed bright lights, experienced lost time, and also documented strange activity that, if true, simply could not be explained. Several independent people who talked with the men in the early hours noted just how shook up they were. In time, the men appear to have gone on and lived full lives. They have done several interviews in past years regarding the case. In 1974, over 70 UFO sightings would occur just north of Stockholm, Sweden, in the suburb of Vallentuna. Over 30 witnesses would report seeing craft over an 18-month period, with the majority happening over a 2-night span. Not only were multiple sightings reported, but at least one alien abduction was reported as well. In addition, the sightings were taken seriously by the Swedish government, who decided to send men to the area. In this episode, we will examine one of Sweden's most famous UFO cases, the Vallentuna sightings. While many residents of Vallentuna spotted UFOs during the time span, 2 incidents that occurred on March 23rd and March 24th of 1974 stand out. On the night of March 24th, 1974, Hillevi and Ingvar Andersson, along with their 3 kids, were resting at home. Hillevi decided to call her mom, who lived only around 15 minutes away. After several attempts, neither her mother or her father answered the phone. Worried, Hillevi gathered the kids and they piled into the car. Ingvar was still working and would stay back home. Hillevi and the kids began driving toward the home, which was located in Orkesta. As they were traveling, though, the group would suddenly see a bright light hovering over a field. It would then vanish. However, it would soon reappear directly behind them. The light was now trailing and appeared to be following them. Hillevi was able to see the craft briefly. It looked metallic, although when she looked again, it turned orange and shrunk, seemingly either vanishing or quickly flying away. As they continued on, they would eventually arrive at Hillevi's parents' home around 8 p.m. Hillevi's dad came outside and told them their phone was out of order and his TV was not working. Then, as Hillevi was telling her dad about the light, they would see the bright light again hovering over some trees in a quarry. There was the big bright light, and also there was a smaller orange light. Several rays of light would come down from the craft onto the ground. At this time, the smaller orange light next to the larger craft began quickly moving in a zigzag motion. The larger craft then shrank and flew away in an instant. After a few minutes, a decision was made to go to Halevi's brother's home. He lived around 5 minutes away by car. As they drove, they didn't spot the craft, but once they reached the home, Halevi's sister-in-law came out and asked them if they saw the light following them. Worried at this point, they decided to leave and head back home toward Halevi's home. Halevi's brother decided to follow them to ensure they got home safe. As they began driving once again, they would soon see both the craft and the smaller orange ball of light. Halevi was scared but also curious and decided to pull over the car. Then the large bright light would hover over the car and engulf it with light. One of Halevi's daughters would attempt to get out, but Halevi stopped her. Later, the daughter would say she heard a voice in her head telling her she needed to come out. The bright object soon flew away and eventually disappeared from sight. The next day, Halevi would call both the police and the Swedish National Defense Research Institute. While they were skeptical at first, soon over 70 reports would come in from at least 30 witnesses reporting to see strange lights in the sky. Halevi would be offered to go through hypnotic regression, but refused as she didn't experience any lost time. Perhaps the stranger story from this event involves a man who did experience lost time. The story of Josta Hagar is truly a frightening one. Hagar was a school janitor who would have an incredible experience on March 23rd, the night before Halevi's encounter. He was walking back from a social gathering and would see a light on the ground. As he walked toward it, a light hit him and he suddenly blacked out and woke up outside his house. His head was bleeding and he had bruises everywhere. His wife woke him up and took him to the hospital. He had no memory of what had happened. In order to recover his memories, Hagar met with Dr. Ture Arvidsson, who suggested performing hypnotic regressions to uncover the lost memories. During the sessions, it was discovered that when the bright light hit Hagar, he was sucked upward onto the craft. He found himself on a table in a large room. There were creatures around him, 4, that were wearing some type of shiny hood. He couldn't make out whether they had hair, but he did see eyes, but no mouth or no nose. He recalled the beings were experimenting on him with some type of metallic tools. Hagar attempted to fight off the beings, but wasn't able to. Interestingly, while under hypnosis, Hagar would scream he couldn't say anything many times. Investigators would conclude that he was somehow had been prevented from telling his story. It was as if the beings had placed some type of thought in his mind around keeping the abduction a secret. The beings told him that they wouldn't hurt him, but they told him as well, according to hypnosis, that they wouldn't allow him to remember. After more tests, it was revealed that he had been exposed to very powerful electrical fields, and also he had developed more senses as well. In time, another witness would state she saw a strange light in the area Hagar was abducted. In response to all the reports, the commander-in-chief in Sweden, Stig Synnergren, asked the Home Defense Department to send staff to the area in case the objects returned. Labeled as Operation S, it was later revealed that after observing the area and the events, it was concluded that there were physical objects over Vallentuna, although no one knew exactly what it was. The unit sent, which was around 50 men, would report seeing unexplained activity in the sky during their time there. One interesting fact surrounding the case is that Hillevi Anderson saw the UFO hovering right where she had a near-death experience. When Hillevi was 4, the quarry at the time had several pools of water that the kids swam in. Hillevi fell in and lost consciousness. She recalled seeing bright lights and being at peace. It might be a coincidence, but it seems strange the UFO chose to hover over that area. There's never been any sort of rational explanation as to what people saw those nights. With so many witnesses, it seems like a strong possibility that people witnessed unidentified flying objects. The stories have never wavered, and these two are just two of many. The last question concerns Hillevi. Was she and her children abducted that night? She clearly didn't experience missing time, but the beings seemed very interested in her. It should also be said that she and her children experienced vomiting, migraines, and a higher level of white blood cells after the event. This could have just been from being close to the craft, or perhaps they were taken. Lake Champlain is a 125-mile-long body of fresh water that resides in the states of Vermont and New York. When most people think about strange events around the lake, they tend to think of the legendary dinosaur-like creature, Champ, which many believe either once lived in the lake or still does. As there's been over 300 sightings of Champ over the years, the lake has experienced some UFO activity as well. In particular, one famous sighting occurred in the summer of 1968. In today's episode, we will examine the UFO sighting and alien abduction that occurred at Buff Ledge, a girls' camp, that year. On August 7th, 1968, at Bluff's Edge Summer Camp, located in Burlington, Vermont, 2 teenagers had an experience that would change their lives forever. Michael Lapp, a maintenance man, and water ski instructor Janet Cornell were enjoying a quiet day on the lake. The day was quiet at the camp since the swim team had left earlier in the day to attend a swim meet. Michael, then 16 years old, and Janet, then 19 years old, were resting and watching the sunset when suddenly a bright light would appear up in the sky. The two initially believed that it was the planet Venus. However, unexpectedly, the light started hovering downward. Then it began to flatten out and appear as a cigar shape. Then 3 smaller lights seemed to break off from the bigger light. The 3 lights then started moving around the lake in surprising ways. They were zigzagging, doing fast loops, and also doing some bizarre maneuvers which clearly reflected that they were being controlled somehow. Then the objects formed a triangle and began approaching Michael and Janet. The two were more curious at the time than worried or scared. 2 of the lights in the triangle appeared to stay back, and one headed right for them. But before reaching them, it shot upward and seemingly disappeared. The object hadn't vanished though. A moment later, the object could be seen across the lake. It then flew down into the water, staying submerged for several minutes before coming out of the water. Once again, the object flew at the 2 teenagers, but this time was much closer. The 2 could see beings in a transparent dome structure on the craft. Michael described the beings as being similar in appearance to children, but having elongated necks, huge eyes that wrapped around their heads, large heads, and also bald. The beings telepathically communicated with Michael and told him they were not here to hurt them, but were interested in obtaining an energy source. The craft then shot down a beam of light at the two, terrifying them. The beam was extremely bright, and Michael said it was so bright he could see the bones in his hand, like an X-ray. It also was described by the two as liquid, as if it would allow them to float freely. As the light was coming down, Michael grabbed Janet's shoulder and pulled her backward onto the dock in an effort to protect her. They were both terrified and knew they were in danger of being taken. Then the two found themselves sitting on the dock, and the big craft was at the edge of the lake. Oddly though, now it was pitch dark, whereas their last memory, the sun was setting. Michael would look over at Janet, and she was in a trance. The UFO moved up into the sky, and the light flew away in the blink of an eye. The next few minutes, a van pulled up, as the swim team had returned. Michael and Janet, both teenagers, did not discuss what happened to them, nor what they saw. In time, the friends went their separate ways. Michael wouldn't be able to forget what happened to him that night though. He kept having horrible nightmares that wouldn't go away. Somehow he knew his nightmares were related to that night. In his nightmares, he was being abducted by something, and despite his pleas not to be taken, the being still did. When Michael was 26 years old, he contacted the Center for UFO Studies and requested help. Walter Webb would investigate the case and suggest hypnotic regression in order to recover more memories. Webb would say he was originally skeptical since the story came 10 years after the event. Also, the claims seemed to align with many other alien abduction stories, and this case seemed too good to be true. In the hypnotic regression sessions, Michael recalled being lifted by the beam into one of the crafts. Once he was inside the ship, he saw Janice laying on one of the tables. Janice was being studied by the beings. They were shining a light in her eyes. They also appeared to be taking skin samples and extracting blood from her body. According to Michael, all the beings looked alike, with two massive large eyes, no mouth, and two holes where the nose should be. With no mouth, it's assumed the beings communicated telepathically with one another. The beings would inform Michael their goal was to make life here on Earth like their life. Janet too would eventually undergo hypnotic regression. She too would remember the abduction and being on a cold table. She recalled something pulling her hair and pinching her neck. Walter Webb would end up writing a 300-page book on the story and publish it in the 1994 book, Encounter at Buff Ledge, a UFO Case History. In general, it seems something happened to Michael Lapp and Janet Cornell on August 7, 1968. While both individuals didn't report this initially, it appears the suppressing of their memories caused immense psychological pain for both of them. Many may question their story and the timing though. Still, this appears to be a double-edged sword. If they had reported very different characteristics than what most alien abductees report, critics would have said their case was too bizarre or too unusual. Also, many have pointed out that both Michael and Janet had moved in different directions. By all accounts, the two weren't in touch and probably wouldn't have been able to coordinate a made-up story like this. Not to mention, perhaps one would be able to avoid hypnosis and create this story, but two people seems extremely unlikely. On top of that, the details of Michael's session were kept from Janet, yet Janet produced details extremely similar to Michael's story. All this lends evidence to the theory both were abducted that night for a short time. As mentioned, this case has many similar characteristics as many other abduction cases. If you're looking for more details surrounding the case, they can be obtained through the 1994 book Encounter at Buff Ledge, a UFO Case History by Walter Webb. In 2007, a former U.S. Marine named Terrel Copeland captured video footage of two white orbs in the air. The sighting wouldn't be the first, and Copeland alleges he began seeing UFOs in 1997 at the age of 15. As time progressed, he saw more and more UFOs and alleged that he even entered one of their ships. Even more strange, some have even suggested that Copeland himself is a hybrid being part alien, part human. By all accounts, Copeland is considered to be a very reliable witness, and in today's episode, we will examine his case in detail. After joining the Marines due to a rare blood disorder, Copeland was forced to end his military career. He moved back to his hometown and began working as a forklift operator in Suffolk, Virginia. In 2005, after ending his shift, Copeland alleges that he saw a triangular-shaped UFO hovering over a shopping center late at night. The object was hovering in the area and wasn't moving at all. In the distance, he would see a fighter pilot jet circling the object. The jet was at a much higher altitude, but was clearly interested in the object. Only a few days later, Copeland would have another sighting. He went to the grocery store, and hovering above the store was an object. It slowly hovered across the store and the parking lot. In 2007, Copeland was sitting in his apartment when he heard a strange noise outside. He got up, looked out the window, and alleges he saw two brightly lit orbs in the sky. They were around 300 feet in the air and changed color. After recording the video with a cell phone, Copeland posted the video online. Many would see it, however, for unknown reasons, the video was taken down. Copeland says his life started to change after posting that video. One day, a man knocked on the door and identified himself as a military contractor. The man made small talk and asked basic background questions. Terrel got a creepy feeling, but still talked with the man. Then, right as he was leaving, he said something that really resonated with Terrel. The mysterious man told him the government was in contact with extraterrestrials. Things would get even more terrifying, though. One day, Copeland woke up from a nap, hearing the doorknob moving to his apartment. There was a scratching on the door. Copeland, though, could only move his eyes, and his entire body was paralyzed. Still frightened, Copeland says he heard a robotic voice through the door say, "You don't need that weapon. We will not do you any harm." Copeland would soon begin to experience lost time, a characteristic reported by many alien abductees. More specifically, he was unable to account for 4 waking hours during a span of 2 nights. In order to help jog his memory, Copeland began keeping a journal and documenting everything he experienced. As he did, he began to recall more memories from the periods of missing time. He recalls being in a strange room and seeing a woman. She had black eyes, an elongated skull, and was surely not human. The next morning, Terrel remembers being on his balcony and waving to the craft as it flew away. In February 2008, he experienced another alien abduction. He fell asleep on his sofa, and when he woke up, he was in a massive white room. The room was filled with tables, and what looked like humans were eating. He was still in the same clothes that he fell asleep in. Initially, when Copeland woke up in his apartment, he thought it was just a dream. However, Copeland noticed something strange in his apartment. A pair of speakers had been placed in front of one of the windows. The speakers were now moved to the side, a place he knew he never had put the speakers. Copeland speculated that the beings came through the window, moved the speakers, and then forgot to put them back as before. While Copeland's case has many of the hallmarks of alien abduction cases, it does have one piece of interesting circumstantial evidence. Copeland's blood disorder was tested by the History Channel's UFO hunters and found to be an unknown, rare blood disorder. The program went on to say that other alien abductees seemed to share this disorder. In a bold and daring statement, show host Bill Burns stated he believed that Copeland was an alien hybrid, or had both alien and human characteristics. Copeland seemed to accept his fate and believes the incidents have made him a better person. He also has stated he believes that he will meet them at some point and that change is coming. All this said, not much can be found on Copeland for present day. It's not clear whether he is still experiencing things or he is just preferring to avoid the spotlight. Many believe Copeland's story is extremely credible due to his reputation. Still, like many alien abductee stories, the story relies heavily on eyewitness testimony. Copeland is considered to have a solid reputation, but some believe that he may have experienced something else. For example, when the doorknob was rattling in his room, many have stated this is a classic case of sleep paralysis. Typically, a person becomes frightened since they cannot move, and their fears begin to come true. In addition, his later abduction could have been a lucid dream. Could it be the case he got up and moved the speakers himself? Copeland believes the beings are still tracking him, and have so for years. Hopefully, though, Terrel has been able to move on and live a peaceful life. On October 15th, 1957, a Brazilian farmer named Antonio Vilas-Boas in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais was working one night in the fields. Only 23 years old, Antonio would soon spot a strange red star in the sky. The red star began flying toward him. As Antonio stared at the red light, he could see that the light was an egg-shaped craft. He would soon be taken, and what happened next would traumatize Antonio for years and would become a truly bizarre alien abduction story. In today's episode, we will examine the strange alien abduction of Antonio Vilas-Boas, the investigation of the event, as well as the implications. On October 15th, 1957, as Antonio was working in the field and the craft approached him, Antonio stared until he could make out the red light was actually an egg-shaped craft with a small dome on top. The UFO began slowly descending to the ground, and as it did, 3 legs descended. Antonio became frightened and attempted to flee. He hopped on his tractor, but after a short time, the engine died. He then hopped off the tractor and began running. However, he didn't get very far. Soon after running, a being around 5 feet tall would grab him and almost stop him. The entity was wearing a helmet, had gray overalls, and small blue eyes. As the one being wasn't strong enough to stop Antonio, soon 3 other beings would catch up, and the 4 would tackle Antonio. They grabbed him and dragged him into their mothership. Antonio said during this time the beings didn't speak but made some type of barking or screeching type of noise. Once Antonio was pulled into the craft, things would go from bad to worse. Antonio's clothes were forcibly removed, and he was covered with a strange gel over his body. From here, Antonio entered a large semicircular room that had strange red symbols on the walls. The entities would draw blood from his chin and then move him to a third room. In here, a strange gas would fill the room, which made Antonio horribly ill. He would stay in this room for around half an hour, and then things would truly become bizarre. Antonio alleges after 30 minutes, a female alien entered the room. She was small, around 5 feet, like the other humanoids, and Antonio says she was extremely attractive. The being had large, blue, cat-like eyes with a pointed chin and long, platinum blonde hair. Being extremely attracted to the woman, Antonio and the entity engaged in sexual intercourse. Antonio noted the being never kissed him, but nipped on his chin. It's not evident from reports that Antonio was forced to do this, but it appears the being was there for one reason only. Even more so, according to Antonio, it appeared that the woman, or being, was relieved once they were done. After they finished, the female looked at Antonio with a satisfied smile and rubbed her belly, pointing up toward the sky. Antonio believes that the being was communicating that they would have a baby and she would raise it in space. After this, Antonio was given his clothes back and given a tour of the ship. As he knew no one would believe his story, he attempted to steal a device that looked like a clock. However, one of the beings took notice and stopped him from doing so. Antonio was then returned home and watched the craft fly up into the sky. After the event occurred, UFO investigator Olava Fontes would examine the story. Fontes was a gastroenterologist who joined the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, or APRO, in 1957. The APRO is an American UFO organization, and Fontes served as a representative for Brazil. Once Fontes joined, documented cases in Brazil would grow substantially. It should be said, though, it probably wasn't the case they weren't occurring. It was just that there weren't enough. On February 22, 1958, about 5 months after the event, Fontes met with Antonio about the experience. Antonio would recall to Fontes how several weeks after the incident, he experienced severe nausea, bad headaches, was lethargic, and had lesions on his skin. Initially, upon meeting with Antonio, Fontes wasn't convinced about his story. However, just 4 days later, Fontes alleges he was visited by officials from the U.S. government and Brazilian government. According to Fontes, he was warned to stop investigating UFO cases. Fontes claimed during this meeting both American and Brazilian officials told him 6 UFOs had crashed in the world since World War II. All the craft were small, and all the occupants had died. The men adamantly stated the occupants were from another planet. Fontes believed the men were Navy officers and told him several other interesting things concerning the UFO phenomenon. 1. All the governments in the world were aware UFOs existed. 2nd, the crafts were powered by some type of electromagnetic field that produces some type of gravitational effect. 3rd, the beings are dangerous and that there was no defense against them. Fontes had several theories on the implications of what he was told. First, the aliens don't appear to have any interest in contacting us on a grand scale. In other words, they want to remain in the shadows. Second, they could be planning a mass-scale invasion, or maybe their goal was to stop humanity from expanding or exploring further in space. Many have pointed out the irony of officials confiding this top-secret information to Fontes as they were discouraging him from looking into UFOs. It should be said, though, Fontes was considered a very skilled writer. Many believe the government wanted this information leaked. It appears that it took years for Antonio's story to become popular and for many to learn of it. Even more strange, maybe, is a claim Antonio was invited by the U.S. government to examine a craft. Dr. Walter K. Bueller, a ufologist, claimed in 1962 the U.S. government contacted his organization and wanted Antonio to come to the United States and inspect a downed UFO. The letter was anonymous, and many believe this was done to push Antonio's story further in the spotlight. In time, Antonio would move on from the incident. He would become a lawyer, marry, have 4 kids, and finally pass away on January 17th, 1991. So what can we make of Antonio's case? Antonio's case was one of the first cases where the investigation revealed UFO crash retrievals and corpses by U.S. officials. In addition, it is considered credible by many, as the abduction happened several years before the Betty and Barney Hill case. Many have pointed out too that Antonio wouldn't have been able to create a story like this. At the time of his abduction, Antonio was a poor, uneducated farmer. However, skeptics have pointed out that Antonio was much more intelligent than the average rural farmer. He went on to study and became a lawyer, which is surely not an easy feat. One other important thing to point out is Antonio was able to recall all these details without the use of hypnotic regression. This lends credence to the event as well. Cases where there is only one witness are understandably met with more skepticism than cases with multiple eyewitnesses. However, by all accounts, Antonio was an honest, hard-working man and never wavered on his story.